Hello everyone, good afternoon, and thank you for giving up your Sunday brunch and joining us today. My name is Kat White and I am an upcoming dialogue author for 2023, but we're not really here to hear about me today. I am joined by three absolutely incredibly talented writers, Angela, Okechukwu, apologies, Okechukwu and Ione. They have written three incredible books. We've got two fiction, one non-fiction, and they cover health, sickness, love, grief, race, coming of age, feminism, masculinity. I finished reading last night and I was up till 2 a.m, gripped, hooked, crying. I'm so excited to talk to them today and for you to be able to experience what I've gone through just being in the minds of these amazingly talented writers. So without further ado, I'd love to just ask you to introduce yourself. Sorry, I already cut you off, Angela. Just say a little bit about who you are and your journey and what brings you here today.
Hi everyone, I'm Angela Chadwick, author of the novel XX, which came out in 2018, and Ungrateful, which is coming out next summer in June.
Thank you. Okechukwu.
Hi, my name is Okechukwu Nzelu. I'm the author of The Private Joys of Nana Maloney, which came out in 2019. And I'm also the author of Here Again Now, which is coming out in March next year.
And I'm Ione Gamble. Poor Little Sick Girls is my first book, which is coming out next year. And I am the founder and editor of Polyesterzine, which is an independent, intersectional feminist culture publication.
Can we give them a round of applause, please? Woo! Amazing. Thank you so much. So, let's get straight in. We're here to talk about your upcoming books. So, could I ask you, and we'll just go down the line again, to tell me a little bit about your book in your own words, or if anyone fancies giving us a little preview and perhaps reading something, I think that could be really wonderful to hear in your voice what you've written. So I'll start with you, Angela, about your book.
Sure, so Ungrateful is fundamentally a story about class, about the impact it has on our ambition and self-esteem, and the effect it has on our relationships. So I will read a little bit. I'm still editing it with lipstick as I was sitting in the front row, but I'll read you a little section from chapter 2, which is a flashback to two of our characters meeting. When James first met Kat, he'd not long started his new job as web manager at Stewart & Wright, an old English clothing firm known for shockingly priced coats and bags. A couple of the guys offered to show him the town's nightlife, and he'd accepted with relief and gratitude. He was new to the area and keen to establish a social circle. At 10 to 8, he found the bar his friends had described and located the somewhat shabby entrance at the side of the building. The stairwell stank of cigarettes, which struck him as unusual. Indoor smoking had recently been banned, and he had become accustomed to the odour's absence. Upstairs, he made his way along a faded carpet to the bar. Several faces looked up at once. A bald man with a tattoo of a tarantula on his neck quickly whipped the cigarette he'd been smoking behind his back as the murmur of conversation ceased. James's face became hot. He felt scrutinised as he positioned himself on a bar stool, aware that at 5'2", he was a great deal shorter than the other men, and they were right now observing this fact. "What can I get you?" The woman behind the bar had a cloud of long dark hair and smooth olive skin. She seemed too good-looking, too young to be working in such a place, yet appeared entirely undaunted by the rather rough-looking men surrounding her. What bottled beers do you have?" He was aware of a couple of men snickering to his right. The barmaid turned to glare at them, and there was instant silence. "Bud or Beck's," she said, beaming at James. Make it a bottle of Beck's then, and one for yourself." He tried a confident smile. He'd never bought a drink for a bartender before, but it felt like maybe this was the kind of thing you should do in a smaller town. He wanted to feel at home in this quiet community, to exchange friendly waves and smiles on the street, raise his children in a place where the parks were free of needles. Across the bar, a white-haired man lit a cigarette with an insolent stare. James sipped his drink nervously. There was an unkemptness to most of the clientele that made him feel self-conscious about his gelled hair and crisply ironed shirt. He looked at his phone. No messages. He hoped the guys would be here soon. The other fellows at the bar were still watching him, and this felt like the kind of place where fights could break out. It got to 8:15, still no sign of his colleagues. He wondered whether it was too early to text, and decided that it was. They might think he was uptight. He'd give them until past. They'd surely be here by then. "You're not from here?" a guy on his left ventured. "No," James turned to face the man. "I've just started working at Stewart and Wright." Another nervous sip from his bottle. "Tommy works at Wright, don't you, Tommy?" The man with the neck tattoo looked him up and down. "Don't know your face, one of the office lot." James nodded. He realised he was running his fingers over the acne scars on his cheek and quickly put his hand down on the bar. "I manage the website." "What you doing here then?" "That's uncalled for." It was the barmaid. She gave James a kindly smile with just a little pity in it. "Another drink?" James nodded with relief, watching her bend down to retrieve the bottle from the fridge. She had the tiniest little bottom, and James felt himself flush as he caught the man called Tommy's eye. Just then, his phone rang, and he was greeted by a burst of laughter. "All right, James, having a lovely time at Martin's. Sorry, mate, it was Tim's idea to send you there. Bloody mean trick, if you ask me, but we couldn't resist it. We're in the wine bar over the road. Next one's on me." James let out a relieved laugh. He wasn't even angry at the prank that had been played on him. He just wanted to leave. Thank goodness this wasn't where his colleagues spent their weekends. As he rose from the bar stool, he noticed the barmaid observing him. She was standing perfectly straight, and there was something defiant in the set of her mouth. Surely she hadn't heard the laughter at the other end of the phone. She placed a new beer bottle in front of him and fixed him with a stare, a challenge. James swallowed. The wine bar was calling. He could already imagine what kind of place it would be. Music, wooden floors, younger, prettier people. But the woman's gaze had such power. All at once he perceived the snobbery and judgment he'd brought to this place and felt a flicker of shame. He sat back down.
Thank you so much, Angela, and we will be delving into this in a lot more detail soon, but without further ado, Okechukwu, would you like to talk to us about your book or read something?
Thank you. I'm going to read a little bit from the first chapter, but just to explain a little bit about what the book's about. It's about 3 black British men, 2 younger and gay, Ione and Achike, and they have always had a kind of a will they, won't they relationship. The third character is Achike's father, Chadwick, who has a lot of problems with regret and all the mistakes he's made in his life, and he's got an alcohol addiction. And I'm going to read to you from the opening chapter, so hopefully you won't need too much more explanation. Ione always heard the music first. Achike gave him something different every time. Some days, Ione would open the front door, and there would be Samuel Coleridge Taylor before him in Achike's hands. There might be Elgar or Chopin, things Achike had taught himself, heard somewhere and reined into his own keen fingers. Reined into himself and then played out, wild again, like the first time it was ever played. Or he might come home early from filming, and Ione would walk across the courtyard to an improvisation on something by Frank Ocean, something Achike had listened to on the way home. Something that made Ione think of fresh air and cool evenings after long, hot days. Something of this was for Achike himself. He worked too hard these days, and he loved to leave hard work and bother behind. He loved to step off the tube and go, step by step, to his home, and close the front door, and hear the busy world continue just outside. He loved this feeling of safety, and so some of the pleasure in the music was for him. But what he did was not for him alone. His music was like offering joy. All his training and listening and the hours of practice were like joy, plated up and pushed across a table to a smile. Achike loved to play and think how his playing could be heard in the street. He didn't care if the neighbours had questions or might complain in the morning. They might, and sometimes did. That was for them. But Achike, he might make Ione happy with a song. He might take music that had been two pieces and make them one. He might loop them both together and play them out to please Ione. 2 favourite things of his, noticed and known and offered. Or he might fly into Heathrow a week late, cursing the director all the way home, and let himself into the flat at 1 in the morning, tiptoeing into his bedroom, so that Ekene woke to the sound of him humming a new piece of his own making, woke to the sound of some creation pouring into his ear, as though Achike were feeding him a dream. And how he fed him. Ekene often dreamed about Achike when he was gone. He was gone too much. Ekene always thought to be happy for his friend in his success, and to think of him doing great things, but sometimes it was hard. When it was hard for him, he thought about the way good light might hit Achike's face in some perfect scene, or how Achike might inspire someone to write some new thing charged with beauty, or perhaps only change a scene, knowing it could be better with Achike in it. Sometimes it was enough just to think of Achike, to think of him smiling in good light. Ekene was rewarded for his faith. He would wait for Achike as long as he could, but the trains were late, and filming ran on, and he sometimes fell asleep before Achike arrived in the big flat with its large windows for the fresh, cold light of the day. Ekene slept, and dreamed of his great friend in the world, and of his friend coming near while the world kept its distance just outside. And sometimes, after dreaming, he woke to find Achike next to him in bed, barely awake, still singing under his breath. Had he sung all night in readiness? I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Okay, it's breathtaking. It's like music hearing you read that. It's really, really gorgeous. Thank you. And Ione, would you love to tell us about your book or read us a little something?
Yeah, I'm not going to read because I'm too nervous and I hadn't prepared on which to pick, and yeah, so I'm not going to read. But Poor Little Sick Girls is an essay collection that kind of grapples with coming into your 20s and the beginning of your adult life with a chronic illness, but also encountering identity politics change and warp and be commodified at every turn. So how it's changed, like how feminism has become has like come from something that's really vital to me to then something we see to sell razors or to sell, other like feminine hygiene products and not like a political movement, and the history of these things, so that this was always the case, and we could kind of seem to think of like social justice movements as being better before the ones that we live in, like, oh, feminism in the 70s was so much more pure, when really we've been having this like celebrification of culture throughout modern history. So it looks at quite a broad range of things, from like the history of unwell women and marginalised people and how we suppress those stories and still why illness is still such a huge taboo, to like our modern beauty standards and how body positivity is kind of just bullshit, and how our beauty standards has come from sick women in Victorian times and we still peddle them today. So it's quite wide ranging. It deals with like relationships and also communities, finding community, the online world, and our obsession with authenticity and how everything is fake, basically.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think that's what I found really interesting reading it, because you root it in feminist theory and in modern day feminism, in your own interpretation of it, and also in what we see around us, the commodification of it. But ultimately, your book stems from your own experiences. And I think that's something that is apparent in all of your books. We kind of see these different themes woven into each other. And actually, the first thing I wanted to talk about was about sickness and health, which really is a thread that runs throughout each of your books, physical and mental health. So could we start just with asking you to share a bit more about that, about what that means to you or to your characters, to the journey of the stories? I'll start with you, Angela. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So I, throughout sixth form college and university, I worked in a really grimy working man's club in a small town. And in a way, it was just as formative as my formal education, because I was kind of exposed to firsthand, really, addiction issues up close, seeing the impact of people's lives, seeing how they hated their behaviour but couldn't help it. And addiction and poverty don't always go hand in hand, but they quite often do. And I see it as in a way, addiction kind of can keep people in that cycle of poverty, and is really stymies upward mobility. So I think being immersed in that environment for so long, I also grew up in a family with some quite significant addiction issues that led to early death of my father at 48. And again, it's just something that feels really kind of close to the bone. It feels entwined with poverty. And I just wanted to unpick it that much more further.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's so interesting. For me, I guess there were two instances of sickness in the novel, two major ones. There's a character who I probably shouldn't name to spoil the story. There's a character who experiences a terrible sort of health event, one of the queer characters, and for me that was part of this larger question about what happens to queer love and a queer love story. You know, so often I think as writers we are faced with the choice of either death or marriage, right? And then if you go with one of them, either one of them is actually quite problematic because it suggests a resolution that doesn't necessarily reflect most queer people's experiences of what love is like. So I thought that really opened questions to me about family and what it looks like when someone isn't there anymore in the same way. But then there's also a character, Chadwick, who is an alcoholic, and that was a really interesting thing for me to write because I'm not an alcoholic myself that I know of, but I've lived with a few. I have a friend who's an alcoholic, and I have in sort of house shares over the years. I've lived with a couple more, and it was the writing journey of this was really interesting for me because I got to write about really the seductiveness of it. And I think even if you don't have an addiction to alcohol, what I think most people can relate to is the fact that alcohol really lubricates a lot of the difficult things in society that we perhaps would rather not face head on, whether that's socialising or asking someone out on a date or any of these other things. And so what I loved writing about that was as sympathetically and empathetically and as gently as I could, kind of blending the research that I'd done, and I have a doctor friend who really very generously explained a lot of how alcoholism affects the body and all sorts of things, and I love being able to sort of blend the hard facts of that, I guess, with the why it happens in the first place and what somebody might be feeling when they're experiencing alcoholism. I wanted to write about it as a disease that is on someone's sort of spirit. So yeah, that was for me.
That's what I found so powerful in both of your books. We really see the human side of it, and we see that struggle, and we see how that impacts the families and those that are living with it as well, which of course Ione is, this is your own experience in your book. So if you wouldn't mind sharing some of that with us.
Yeah, I think when I resisted writing about being chronically ill for like a long time, because I kind of came up through journalism in a time where it was considered demeaning to write like personal essays. It was like the personal essay era, like sell something for £20 to someone and like bleed your trauma onto the page and then move on to the next thing and mine yourself for something else. So I think I was kind of like ingrained in that it wasn't right to do that, or you were kind of like degrading yourself a bit by doing it. But I think that puts like not just ill people but lots of marginalised people in a trap where it's like you can either be exploited or you stay silent. And I think with illness in particular, because I became unwell at 19, I faced so much shock, like entering into professional industries, like with friendships, like people pity unwell people, and I'd really like to like challenge that in a way, because if someone's a success when they're unwell, they're an anomaly. Like we look at Frida Kahlo and we think, oh, she's amazing, but poor her, she was in bed so much. And I kind of want to show how like illness is as much a part of my life as, like as much as I like to go to dinner, I have to go to hospital. As much as I like to like see my friends, I have to consider things. And it doesn't mean that it's the only part of my life, but it's a part of it that informs all else. So in my opinion, this is why I could kind of like see the tiny little flaws in identity politics and how we were really exploiting these people, and see the flaws in like the way that fourth wave feminism was being commodified, or like any identity-based political movement. And it kind of has like allowed me this lens to approach the way I live in a different way, in that like I realised I just have to do whatever I want and like think whatever I believe in. And it's a burden in so many ways, but it's not in a lot of ways, because I am still the person I am, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredibly powerful, and I think causes us to reflect as well, because of course delving into chronic fatigue or alcoholism obviously then causes you as the reader to reflect on your own experiences and the different ways that you may or may not fit into these things that we're exploring. So I've found it really, really powerful. And I think also the flip side of sickness and of exploring that is obviously health. And what we see in all of your books is that there is always somebody who is having to or choosing to look after or who is impacted by whatever it is that we're going through. And I mean, we see father and son, mother and daughter, father and daughter. You know, we see the whole spectrum of familial relationships, which you've already touched on a bit, Okechukwu, but I'd love to delve into that a bit more, not necessarily just in relation to sickness and health, but just what family means to each of you.
I think for me it's about identity and how it's a big part of how my characters define themselves is by looking at their parents and, you know, taking that as the standard of what they do or don't want to be. But also, I think familial relationships can be really painful because you have to love these people in your lives, but they're flawed beings with their own desires and wants and behaviours that you don't necessarily agree with. So I find the drama of that quite compelling. I love to read kind of really knotty, complicated family dramas, and it's something that I wanted to explore a bit more when I was writing my book.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it, what you say about kind of loving these flawed people. And I think there's something about family that sort of binds you to somebody and sort of almost forces you to see things about them that are lovable that you might not necessarily see in another context. And I'm particularly interested in this because my novel was sort of loosely inspired by the Old Testament book of Ruth, which, if you're not familiar with it, is this wonderful story. It's actually very short. One of only two books, I think, in the Bible where the protagonist is female. And essentially Ruth marries into a Jewish family, and then her husband dies, her father-in-law dies, her brother-in-law dies, and only these three women are left: Ruth, her sister-in-law Orpah, and her mother-in-law Naomi. And what happens is Naomi says to Ruth, you know, the time has come for you to go back to your family now. Your home is no longer here. Your place is no longer with us. And Ruth refuses and says, please don't send me away. Where you go, I will go. Your God will be my God. And these two women very literally help each other to survive. They help each other find food, and their story is one of support in a kind of familial structure that has technically no familial bonds to it anymore. Those have been dissolved, and yet they form this very, very profound relationship that's unlike anything else that's in that entire book for me. And I was really interested in what family means when it means that you choose when it means that you choose the people as family. How profound can that be? What opportunities for love and healing and understanding are there when really you kind of could just walk away if you want to? So for me, I guess family is, I'm really trying to push the boundaries of what family really means. I think often we think of family as this very, of this institution that is just as exclusionary as it is inclusive. You know, it can be this very kind of, you're not one of us, and we give these resources and these feelings to these people who fall within these bounds, but people who fall outside of that really are pushed out of that. And I think if you don't come from a very large, supportive, loving family, you can really understand what it's like to be outside of that. So I really wanted to, especially within a queer context, to say, okay, maybe you didn't get this from birth, but maybe you can still have it. And in fact, if we push these boundaries and if we question this sort of received wisdom about what family has to mean, that doesn't just help queer people who are often excluded, it helps everybody. I think often the things that, you know, that hold queer people down are the things that hold everybody down in the same ways that things that hold, you know, black people and women, you know, and working class people down are things that hold everybody down. So I wanted to write a novel that sort of had as big a family in a sense as possible.
For me, I suppose my book doesn't like tackle family straight on, especially because like I didn't live in my family home when I became unwell, and a lot of it is like interweaving my experiences with how they relate to like the current socio-political climate or just like social climate. So a lot of what I go back to in all the essays, like whether it is talking about body positivity or like coping mechanisms or the fact that we like all rely on Instagram infographics to make us feel better, is that our idea of like family and belonging has become such a commodity that we believe we can like buy into, or like we've been lied to, we've been conned to that we can buy into it basically. Like, you know, there's that tweet that's like, I don't know, mini cheddars are your friends, like ITV wants to take you for a drink, whatever, and it's like we're being conned with this sense of over familiarity that stops us actually going into our communities and like working as a community. Body positivity doesn't work like when it's H&M trying to sell us a plus size dress. It does work when it's like a group of fat people trying to talk to each other and systematically break down things. So like it's looking at the history of like, I suppose, how people have built their own communities and families through like their shared experiences, including illness, and like how this is now all moved online, and what does that mean for how we connect with each other and interact with each other. And the book does also look at, you know, like perceived guilt of being ill and your family or your friends or your partner having to deal with you being ill. Like, what does that do for a relationship? And kind of looking at examples of that have happened throughout history and how they present it in this very practical way. Like if you're in a relationship with an ill person, it's just like, there's an example of Chris Kraus, I Love Dick, and she says her husband only married her so she could get on the health insurance. And obviously that's an American thing. But that's kind of, we read that line and we think, oh, that's a practical. But actually that's like very romantic. Like this person is saying they want to look after you, they don't mind looking after you, they don't think you're a burden. So I look at that in terms of like more a relationship thing, but it's really like overarching, looking at how we relate to each other now.
Yeah, and I think something that stuck with me from your book was you said that when we become unwell, we lose our usefulness to society. And that idea of being useful, I think especially maybe after the year or two we've just had, it's like, well, do we need to value ourselves based on our use? And I think actually all of you explore that in a different way because, well, I'm going to ask you to speak about it, but we see career and ambition, and I mean, one of your characters is the absolute top of their game. I don't know if I should say what they do, but they're, you know, an incredibly successful person, but possibly that isn't enough. And we see with your protagonist, Kat, she is the most incredible woman who is doing everything she can to change the world and go back to university at the age of 40. She does. And then this quote about usefulness, it really stuck with me. I don't know, could we go a little bit deeper into that and what this idea of use and ambition and career means in your books?
I mean, I suppose, so I studied fashion journalism at uni, and I grew up kind of like loving all these TV shows that showed, you know, intern to editor to like top of the world, whether it was like Devil Wears Prada, Ugly Betty or Gossip Girl or like even The Hills, like all these people where it's like you work yourself to death, but it's worth it because you get loads of free clothes and nice drinks and it's a really, really fun time. So it's like, great, that's exactly what I'm going to do. It's going to be amazing. And then I got there and I realised it was absolutely the most awful thing in the world because like these people, you are only how much you can produce. And you're not something, like, I think that can go for so many industries as well. Like, we see people, and our own ambition kind of feeds into it in a way that we want to climb to these things. We want to do it very quickly, and when we're, like, still young to a certain extent, and we have limited time, so we'll work all hours of the day. We'll do this, we'll do that. And if there is a reason, whatever reason why you suddenly can't, then you are basically, like, outcasted from normal society. Obviously, we all hope the pandemic would change that with like such the quick shift to like working from home and like flexible working, all of these things. I mean, I honestly don't think it's going to change long term because we're already seeing people like being forced back into offices. We need to have this like fake belief that what we're doing is important, and the only way something can be important is if we're like contributing to systems that like not only oppress us but they don't benefit us even like monetarily most of the time. Like we're being worked for like very little money because it's like a fun creative thing. And if you're ill, you suddenly have to check out, like there's no choice. So I think most marginalised communities are at like a point now where we can build different realities, and we really just have to like seize that moment as opposed to like keep trying to like remain on a conveyor belt that doesn't serve us at all.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I think that but that's kind of links into what one of my characters is experiencing. So I think I can probably say, I think it says in the blurb, Achike is a very successful actor. He's just sort of having his big break. But at the same time, quite early on in the novel, there's a conversation about what success really means and the fact that, okay, he's got this thing which most people will never experience and which has provided him with financial wealth, really, is the right word for it. It allows him to provide for his family, even though his family at that point is his father. But at the same time, he's kind of having second thoughts about what it really means to be successful, and he's wondering how much does he really want this thing? His job is very demanding. It makes demands not just on his time and that take him away from Ekene, his friend of more than 20 years, and from his father, but also it makes demands on him physically. It's changed his body. His body always has to look a certain way, and that means that, although I wouldn't necessarily describe his eating as having an eating disorder, I'd describe it as disorderly. The way that he eats is very, very, very closely monitored, and he has to be very, very careful about it, and everything has to sort of be part of an equation that has to be a zero sum. So for me, I think in this novel, this question of sort of usefulness is one that's, it's an intrusion really on what he wants to do. He came into acting because he loves it, but then with sort of a certain definition of success came, this intrusion of he has to be able to provide certain things for other people that are not necessarily his own priorities.
I think for me, I was really looking at working class communities and what success means to a lot of people who've been raised in a way that isn't necessarily, it doesn't encourage them to follow their own aspirations. So for my main character, Kat, success as a younger woman meant living in a nice house and not having to worry about bills. She gets there, she takes a kind of shortcut and finds a man that provides it with her, for her. But then as she gets older, I think she's faced with more kind of existential, okay, well, I've got this now. What does this mean? What is my usefulness to the world? What do I actually want of my life? Do I just want 40 more years living in a nice house? Is that enough? And I suppose it kind of, she reached the point in her life where success, as defined by nice carpets and relatively new furniture, just doesn't feel the way she expected it to feel when she was a working class woman living in a damp council house. And so her journey's really redefining what success means for herself and trying to get there.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about feminism, about gender roles, about masculinity? I mean, they're interwoven so strongly into all of your books and relate to everything we're speaking about as well. So can we just go back down and talk a little bit about what that means to you, how it's been infused into your book, why it's important, what you're exploring?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, it all stems back to that working man's club when I was a student, where misogyny was so embedded and so kind of an expected part of working there. I wouldn't stand for it now, but back then it was just seen as normal, as part and parcel of making a living. So I wanted to delve into that and kind of explore it and expose it in the book. But I also wanted to look at the psychology of that, kind of what it means to be objectified, to kind of feel that your value is grounded in your looks. And then what happens as you get older and those looks that have kind of determined your status in the eyes of your community start to fade? What are you left with, and how do you go about rediscovering your own value?
Yeah, for me, it was really about masculinity very strongly in this novel. The writer J.P. Brammer talks about how masculinity is this thing which makes such deep demands of us and gives us so little in return. If you think, especially if you're queer, if you think about the way that gay men, for example, have to sort of police our behaviour, don't do this, don't speak with that kind of voice, don't wear that thing. And then what do you get in return once you give those things up that make you happy or that make you who you are? What do you really get? And J.P. Brammer makes the point that you don't even really get safety. So I wanted to question that and to say, okay, if we have this prison really that is really quite painful and harmful for a lot of people, what else is available? I think that's really quite central to the experience of being a queer person is, okay, I've been denied this. What else is there? What can I make? What can I forge or put together? And so really central to this novel is this idea that I think, I think it's very easy to overstate the role that black men play in homophobia. I think it's very easy to sort of overlocate and homophobia in the black male community. But I know that it's a problem that a lot of queer people who are black have experienced. And so I wanted to write about, I wanted to give people who were struggling with the idea of, if you were I was almost writing it for a homophobic father, really. You know, if you have a queer child and you don't know what it looks like to love them fully and generously and openly, here's one way of doing it. I wanted to sort of say, this isn't something that we necessarily see very often, but it is possible. And I wanted to say, okay, here's how, in a way.
And I think for me, yeah, it's kind of similar to what you're saying about like building something, like what can you do to bring you joy. And for me, feminism when I was like a teenager was it basically felt like freedom. Like it was a way to find people that I really connected with, to like creatively indulge myself, to like build what I wanted to build from a career, all of these things. And it's kind of looking at when that turned, not just for me, but for like all of fourth wave feminism, and that moment when things started to be commodified, and what happens when a movement loses meaning but you still really believe in it and you still really want it to succeed. And in that way, it's kind of looking at like what happens to not just feminism but a lot of intersecting issues when a political issue becomes your identity. Like feminism should be a socio-political plight, but I identify as a feminist now. And what does that like kind of like, sounds like a very like subtle change, but what does it mean when we stop like advocating for policy, which has never been the type of feminist I am. Like I'm not an academic feminist. Instead we're looking to pop culture for feminism. And it's not saying one is like more morally superior to the other or what it means, but like how maybe the identity based stuff leaves us more open to this commodification, which basically erodes meaning and what we all loved about the thing in the first place. So it's looking at like, yeah, this sense of belonging, and how being like a woman or an ill person or kind of anyone that did seek belonging on the internet has kind of finding that becoming increasingly empty over time as the internet changes so much and how we approach these issues changes so much.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about home. And I must admit, I found it quite shocking when lockdown crept into. I wasn't expecting that both of your books existed in that world, and that it felt quite jarring. I guess we're going to start to see now works coming out that have been created over the last couple of years. We're going to see it infiltrating. It was like Help. I don't know if anyone watched Help, the Channel 4 thing, and it was really weird to see that reflected. Obviously, home is something that now we are all. It's never been more familiar to us, and we see home go from, for Kat, a place of safety and freedom to something really intensely claustrophobic and horrific, to be honest. And I mean, for Achike, his home is, we heard it when you read earlier, we actually heard the music wafting out of his home. It's a beautiful place that then obviously changes as well. And Ione, you speak a lot about your bed and what your bed means to you as someone who is unwell, and what your bed, the journey with your bed, which I honestly just found so moving. And yeah, just something that I'd never heard explored before. And I loved the status you gave to that space. So if, I don't know, could we talk a little bit about home and what that means?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'm looking at you. So.
Yeah, I think for the bed essay, it's kind of looking at, again, that like extreme optimization that we place on ourselves to always be on and always to be working and to be optimizing yourself. Like if it's not work, then it's exercise. If it's not exercise, then it's, you know, having drinks with your friends or networking, or you're always trying to optimize your life. And what happens when you are forced to check out of that? Like what happens in my case, like when you have to spend so much time in bed because it's like physically painful, you're physically too tired to leave. In that way, like nothing changed for me over lockdown because it was the same before, during, after. Like I spend a lot of time in bed anyway, regardless. But it was kind of just like challenging this idea that if you are, you know, more someone that does have to spend a lot of time in bed, or just someone that like, you know, doesn't want to work so much, who doesn't like want to give their life over to optimization, that you're lazy or that you're unworthy of like respect or all these other things. And it's looking at like kind of how my bed feels like extremely liberating, because at times it does provide me with the tools to be productive because it is like this comfy cushion, and other times it feels like prison because it's physically inescapable and there's no way of being productive. So it's just looking at that tension and like how one space has to be everything for you and what that means like emotionally, I suppose.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I definitely think of home as when I was younger, when I was a kid, we moved around a lot. I think my parents immigrated to this country, and I think that they perhaps didn't understand in the way that I would the sort of the value of stability and stasis for children, and we moved around a lot for various reasons. And so when I came to write this book, especially thinking about the Book of Ruth and the inspiration that that gave me, I definitely thought of home as a thing that you make rather than a place that you have. And for Achike, for him, home is all about, okay, so I've got this money, I've got this opportunity, what can I do with that? How can I translate that into a kind of love for the people that matter to me? And he gets it right in some ways and perhaps not so right in others, and he's really struggling because, he's a gay man, and what does it mean to be a gay man in a familial context if you're, in 2021, especially for black? And he really has no direct models for that. So I wanted to write about, I guess, what different things that home can mean, different ways that you can make it, and I guess I kind of wanted to be forgiving about and compassionate about the stumbles that you might make along the way.
Yeah, I think for me, lockdown in the book, it sort of turned home from a trophy into a kind of prison. But it was interesting. I'd written the book and sold it prior to lockdown. But when I came back into the editing, I think because I wanted it to be really kind of engaging with the current political moment, I wrote lockdown in. I think because I look at inequality, lockdown for me really brought that to the fore because, for working class people, a lot of people are reliant on cash in hand income, which dried up, there being no kind of furlough to support that. A lot of people, while the rest of society were joyfully working from home and baking banana bread, were having to trek out and do their day jobs in care homes and in quite, dangerous situations. So it's although it wasn't intentional, it wasn't in the book in the first draft, it spoke to some of the themes that I kind of couldn't not include it when I was doing my rewrites.
That's so interesting because for me it's right at the heart of it. You explore it, it heightens everything you're exploring. I couldn't imagine it without it. That's really interesting to know. I've got so much more I want to ask, but I thought since we've only got 15 minutes, I'd better open the floor and give other people a chance to speak, because I'm sure you've got some questions that you would love to ask. So would anyone like to ask anything to any of our brilliant authors? Don't all speak at once. Yes, please. Thank you.
Really interesting, first of all, to hear. Thank you. It was really interesting, first of all, to hear the perspectives that you all bring to the table, as it were. But I was wondering, with all of the exploration that you speak about, what has the shift been for you in your day-to-day lives now that your books have been essentially completed and ready for publication? Have you seen a shift in your life, in your personal lives, after spending all of this time to explore these themes?
Interesting. For me, I think writing for me is a way of exploring my own thoughts and deepening it. And I don't know if I see kind of radical change in my life, but I feel like I'm always searching for answers to questions and trying to clarify how I feel about certain things. And writing is certainly an integral part of that, but it doesn't feel like a process that will ever finish. So I kind of haven't had I'm done. This is it. This is the magnum opus. I think I finished book 2 and got straight on to book 3, kind of tackling similar themes, but also some new ones. And I see it being an ongoing process that will carry on forever.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Yeah, definitely. Except for me, I guess I've had a series of "I'm done" moments with this book. This is more or less the final version of it. But I've had a series of "Okay, now it's done." Oh no. Okay, now it's done. Okay, now it's done. And so I think now I think it really very nearly is done. But yeah, much the same. I've I've got a third book that I'm researching and I've started writing, and I've got ideas for a fourth book as well that I kind of want to do at the same time. And I guess I need to learn how to take a break and stop working, which is very relevant to what we've been talking about today. But in a way, life hasn't really changed at all since I finished this book, because I went straight on to another one. My friend once told me that the best thing you can do to sort of help the sort of anxiety and the panic of having a book out and being exposed in the world is to be halfway through the next one by the time that one comes out. And I found that to be very true with my first one. So I'm going to push on with the next one or two books.
I think I'm still pretty much in the middle of it. Like, I've handed in my manuscript, but it's still going through edits and stuff. So I suppose it just still feels like a surreal experience to be able to do it, and looking towards the publication date with like nerves and excitement. But it doesn't really feel like anything is wrapped up or changed. Maybe changing, but not changed, or I don't know what the end looks like, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Good question. Anyone else? Yeah, please. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you. They all seem really, really interesting books, and I can't wait to read all of them. But I was just wondering, especially within this talk, you all seem to have brought up the idea of prisons in different contexts, and sort of those ones that are either self-created or created by society. And I was just thinking, the publishing industry as a whole, do you think it's changing and actually looking to address these prisons within society, or sort of the structures, and sort of more wanting to address the taboo issues, as it were? And is actually seeking for that material now? And do you feel that quite like freeing as an author, or do you feel it's quite a lot of pressure to sort of live up to that, or whether it gives you more play sort of room, or I don't know. I just found that quite intriguing.
It's a great question. I think for me, Dialogue Books, our publisher, was an absolute game changer in the industry. For those of you that don't know, they're an imprint that's specifically dedicated to underrepresented voices. And my book, my first book, XX, it had a lesbian relationship at the heart, and it got lots of near misses with publishers. But Dialogue kind of embraced it for what it was, and that felt incredibly freeing, because I felt a lot of the other publishers wanted me to rewrite it as something different, and that would have kind of lost some of my original intention. So I think Dialogue have forced the industry as a whole to up their game, and I've really noticed that because I'm actually the judge for the Polari Prize, and I have been for the last couple of years, and it almost feels that areas of publishing that used to be seen as quite niche, such as LGBTQ stories, working class stories, suddenly a lot more mainstream publishers are embracing them and putting marketing budgets behind them, which I think is a really, really positive development. It's positive for me as a reader, because I don't like necessarily reading about white middle class dinner parties at Islington. It's just great to be able to pick up a really diverse range of voices at the front of the bookshop, instead of having to squirrel away at the back and look for something more niche.
Yeah, I think I would definitely echo what you say about Dialogue especially. I think I'm really grateful to be with a publisher where there's no expectation that you butcher up, or you have a white central character who is relatable to the presumed reader or anything like that. I feel very comfortable with Dialogue in that way. It's really, really nice. I think what's interesting perhaps in publishing more broadly is, I think, something that you touched on, Ione, about sort of performing trauma, where I think often it seems like you do have this choice to be either sort of paid to perform your trauma for an audience which is just really just spectating in a kind of way that's quite problematic perhaps, or you can not be published at all, and I'm really grateful to be with Dialogue that does not make those demands on you in any way. But I guess it's a concern I have more broadly. I've never really wanted to write autobiographically, but I know that people assume that I have sometimes. My first novel was about a mixed race teenage girl, and people were like, yeah, so that was about you, wasn't it? And I was like, no. But I think there's a weird appetite which I think publishing is still finding its way to figuring out how to address.
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually have much experience in book publishing. Like, this is my first book. Yeah, but I think in what I'm more used to working in, like magazines and zine publishing, I think there's like always demand for like these stories and this representation, and it's just about finding the people that do it in the way that resonates with you. And it's not that they don't exist, it's that maybe they aren't funded in the same way, or they aren't given the like monetary injections that are needed to make, you know, these publications or these authors or whoever as big as like the Vogues or the whoever. But it is there, and I think it's up to like audiences as much as it is to kind of prove we've proven the demand. How do we make the people at the top listen? Like, how do we actually challenge these power structures? Or, as I was saying, do we just like disregard them entirely and decide to like try and build our own utopias? And what would that even look like? Like, disregarding a hierarchy that we've relied upon for so long. I think that's what I'm interested in. And I think there's always this question of like, do things change? And I think they do, but they don't always change. Nothing changes quickly enough, and they don't always change in the most positive of ways. So, like, for an example, like body positivity, like, yeah, we accept like a size 12, but if they look a very specifically certain way and still perform beauty standards, like, I'm interested in how we just throw it all away and build something better, not try and like squirm into the tiny little holes that we've been told we're allowed to fit in, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, well, you've all been brilliant, but it's really interesting to see the final or nearly final product of what you've created. But I was wondering if you could tell me like what the catalyst was for the ideas behind your books, your essays, like how you just got that first, I don't know, idea or notion in your head to begin that.
I'll go first again. For me, actually, interesting question. For me, it starts with character. So my central characters have been in my subconscious for 20 years, I'd say. And I first started writing on the notebook to college, my character about Kat. And at the time, she was 17, like I was 17. And the stories I wrote about her were you know, very different to what's in the final book now. I came back to those characters when I was about 30. Again, completely different plot. Nearly sold a book, but not quite. And then I came back to her again when I was 40. So, yeah, just it starts with character. And it sounds really weird. It's almost like having an imaginary friend in my head. But for me, that's where it really starts. It's a very clear sense of someone, and then placing them in a situation and asking how they would behave tends to be the catalyst for me.
That's so interesting. I think for me, it starts with a dynamic or a relationship between characters. So I knew, so I talked about the Book of Ruth, which was a major inspiration for this. And I just, it's hard to explain, but I was more interested almost in the thing between the people than I was in the people themselves. And I really wanted to explore, I guess in this book and my first book as well, my question that I guess I'm always asking is what else can love look like? So I really wanted to look at the thing that's between people as this dynamic, plastic, changeable thing.
I think for me, a starting point is quite often what I'm annoyed by, or if I disagree with something, or if I want to provide an alternative point of view. But throughout kind of everything else I've done with my publication Polyester, it's always been about championing an alternative. So like, instead of straight critiquing something, it's like, well, this is what it could be, like, this is what I would like things to look like, or these are the voices that I care about and the people that I want to platform. And I kind of began to think about what are actually all these opinions I hold, like what does it mean to sit with them and dig into them and actually critique them in the hopes of the same thing, like providing a better alternative, but really dissecting the current moment and how these kind of touch points in my life have built up to it. So the first essay I wrote was Bed, and it was after reading Viv Albertine's book. I can't remember if it was her first or second one, where she talks about being in bed quite a lot. It was kind of starting to piece together all these narratives of like sick women that we get in glimpses. So we get like tiny pieces of unwell women a lot, but never enough that it's actually a focal point. And I wanted to see what happens if you do that in a way that is like not fitting it into your life. It's like how your life fits around it, I suppose.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question. If anyone would like to. Thank you so much. Yeah, right at the back there.
Thank you. Thank you. This was brilliant. I just wanted to ask, as earlier we were talking about ideas of success and those ideas being shattered once we've reached that pinnacle that we'd looked to. And I was just wondering, once that sense of identity had gone, what the individual was left with, since it was such a basis for someone's personality.
I think for my character, it really is. It's starting all over again. It's once your kind of illusory success is shown for the thing that it really is, and the meaninglessness it really has. It's starting again, and asking yourself what on your deathbed do you want to have done? What kind of person do you want to look back and say you've been?
Yeah, and I think for my character, I probably won't say too much because it's a question that goes on throughout the whole book, so I don't want to spoil it, but it's something that he's perhaps more ambivalent towards than more straightforwardly negative, and Achike is really thinking about, you know, so he's got essentially everything he's wanted since he was like 8 years old, but it's not so much that he hates it entirely, it's more that, okay, but what can I really do with that? And he's still asking that question a lot of the time. So yeah, I hope you read the book and I hope you enjoy it.
I think once that happens, I think this is such a natural thing. Like, you know, you set your life up with ambition. You think, once I get to this point, I'll be satisfied. And then what you're really starting to do is build yourself a next little point and the next little point. So you just kind of keep squirreling away. And when that whole illusion is shattered, I think it's a very, like, it can feel very destructive and horrible and sad, but it really is a positive thing, because it means you can actually think, oh, well, I thought I wanted this the whole time, but like, what does it mean to be happy? Like, does it mean working all the time, or does it mean, you know, lying down for 8 hours, or does it mean spending more time with your friends, or does it mean that everything is a bit arbitrary? So I can, like, it's quite emancipating being like, oh, I thought this is what I wanted. Maybe I don't really know, so let's just see what happens. Or you set yourself new goals that are maybe healthier, and I think as long as we kind of, aspire to these things that seem out of reach, but then you do get to them eventually. It's whether that will actually make you happy or not. And it can for lots of people, and it doesn't for some people. And it's about that constant, like, reassessment of yourself, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we are very nearly out of time. So I just wanted to also quickly let you know that Angela and Okechukwu will be signing copies of your books at the Waterstone stand, if anyone fancies that, which is very exciting. And just then to say, firstly, thank you to all of you. You've all been such an amazing audience. And thank you to our authors, their first live book event of the last 2 years, first ever. So you've been brilliant. So thank you to you. And thank you so much to you. Have a very nice lunch and rest of your day.
I can't wait to read both your books. I can't wait.